The day Goku arrived in the world of heroes, peace did not get stronger. It became irrelevant. There was no warning, no shockwave of trembling air rolling across the skyline before he appeared. No emergency broadcast cutting through morning television. No slow, dramatic descent from orbit. One moment, the sky above Musutafu was empty, blue, clean, ordinary. And the next, there was a man standing in it. Just standing. Hundreds of meters above the street. No wings, no propulsion, no visible quirk manifesting around him. Just a man in an orange guy, arms folded loosely across his chest, staring down at the city below with the calm expression of someone deciding where to eat lunch. And the world broke open. The first person to see him was a street vendor on the corner of a busy market block. She looked up because the light changed, not dimmed, not blocked, just shifted. The way light shifts when something passes through it that does not belong there. She saw him and dropped everything she was holding. She did not scream. She did not run. She simply looked up at the floating man in orange and could not find a single word in any language she knew that came close to describing the problem. Within 60 seconds, 3 mobile phones had footage. Within 3 minutes, it was trending. Within 10, every pro-hero dispatch in Musutafu was lighting up with priority alerts. And within an hour, the world was asking a question it had never needed to ask before. What do you do when someone appears in your sky and the sky itself does not seem to mind? At first, the analysts assumed it was a quirk. It was always a quirk. That was the lens the world had used to understand power for generations. A genetic gift, cataloged, measured, ranked, and filed. Someone capable of flight was a flight type. Someone projecting energy was an emitter. Someone standing motionless at altitude in a resting state with no visible strain and no recorded mutation profile was a problem. The Commission's preliminary scan returned nothing coherent. His energy signature did not match any registered quirk class. His cellular structure refused easy categorization. The instruments that had mapped the biology of hundreds of thousands of quirk users simply sat there, blinking, as though the data they were receiving was too quiet and too enormous at the same time, like trying to measure the ocean with a ruler. He descended eventually, not because anyone told him to, not because he was cornered or threatened. He came down because he noticed the crowd gathering below and smiled. This wide, unguarded, genuine smile. The kind that belongs on a child's face on the morning of something wonderful. And he drifted to the ground with the casual grace of a leaf that had chosen its landing spot. He said something. The nearest bystander, a teenage girl who later became briefly famous for the 30 seconds of footage she captured, later described his voice as warm and a little confused, like someone who had arrived at a party they had not been invited to but was not particularly bothered about it. He was looking for someone strong to fight. He said it plainly, not as a threat, the way you would ask for directions to a restaurant, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing Musutafu had heard in years. The heroes arrived fast. You have to give them that. Within minutes, the most capable pro-heroes in the region were on scene, experienced, ranked, trained for exactly this kind of high-level unregistered individual situation. They arrived with protocols and authority, and the weight of institutional heroism behind them. They arrived ready, and then they looked at him, and something shifted in the air between what they had prepared for and what was actually standing in front of them. It was not that he looked terrifying. He did not. He looked almost cheerful. But there is a particular kind of dread that comes not from a thing that threatens you, but from a thing that simply does not register you as a threat at all. And every hero on that street felt it in the same moment. A cold, sliding foundational feeling, like standing on ground you suddenly are not sure is solid. Here is what My Hero Academia is at its core. It is a civilization that decided power could be domesticated, ranked, licensed, channeled into something socially useful. For generations it had worked. The strongest people wore capes and filed paperwork and stood between ordinary citizens and disaster. The system was imperfect. Everyone knew it was imperfect. But it held. It held because the most powerful things in the world were still products of that world. They grew from its soil. They understood its rules, even when they broke them. And that mutual understanding, that shared grammar of power, was the invisible architecture that kept everything upright. What arrived in Musutafu that morning did not share that grammar. It had not grown from that soil, and it did not know those rules existed. Because this was not just a man who was stronger than the heroes. The world had seen strong men before. What made Goku genuinely dangerous to the architecture of My Hero Academia was something subtler and more catastrophic than raw power. He was operating on a different logic, a different cosmology of what strength meant, where it came from, and what it was for. Hero Society had spent decades building an elegant, functional answer to the question of human power. And Goku, smiling pleasantly in the street with his arms at his sides and not a drop on bone of aggression in his body, was a walking proof that the question had a second answer. One the system had never considered, one it had no framework to absorb, and one that, once visible, could not be made invisible again. If you want to understand what it would actually mean for Goku to arrive in the world of My Hero Academia, not just what he would do, but what his existence would do to that world, then stay with this. Because this is not a story about who wins. Everyone already knows the answer to that. This is a story about what happens to a civilization when a myth walks into its bureaucracy and smiles. What happens to heroes who have spent their lives being the ceiling when they meet someone who does not acknowledge ceilings exist? What happens to villains who have built their entire ideology around hating a system when a man arrives who makes that system look like a children's drawing of power? If you want more crossovers like this, stories where two universes collide and neither walks away the same, subscribe, because we are just getting started. And trust me, what happens next is going to change how you see both worlds forever. To understand why Goku's arrival would be so catastrophic for the world of My Hero Academia, you first need to understand what that world actually is, not the surface version, the colorful costumes, the ranked heroes, the dramatic villain battles, the deeper version, the structural version. My Hero Academia is not simply a world where people have superpowers. It is a civilization that was redesigned around superpowers. 80% of the global population carrying genetic quirks did not just change what humans could do. It changed how humans organized themselves, how they assigned value, how they defined safety, and most critically, how they understood the concept of human potential itself. The moment quirks became universal, the world had to answer a new question. Who gets to use that power, and on whose behalf? Hero Society is that answer. Imperfect, commercial, deeply political, but functional. And it has been the only answer the world has ever needed, until now. Think about what heroism actually means in this system. It is not just courage. It is not just strength. It is a licensed profession, a regulated industry. Heroes register their quirks. They attend academies. They pass examinations. They receive provisional licenses before they can legally use their abilities in public. They operate within hero offices, under agency structures, ranked annually by public approval and performance metrics. The strongest heroes become public figures, celebrities whose personas are as carefully constructed as their combat records. They have sponsors. They have merchandise. They attend press events. They manage their image with the same seriousness they manage their training. Because in MHA, power divorced from public legitimacy is not heroism. It is a villain. The line between hero and villain in this world is not drawn by morality alone. It is drawn by permission, and permission flows from the system. That distinction is everything, because Goku does not have permission. Goku does not know permission exists, and he would not particularly care if he did. Hero Society's deepest assumption, the one it has never had to examine, is that all significant power comes from quirks. Quirks are genetic. They are biological destiny. You are born with your ceiling. You can train to reach it faster, control it better, combine it more cleverly. But the ceiling exists. Every hero, no matter how extraordinary, operates within the upper boundary that their DNA set for them. This is not a tragedy in that world. It is simply reality. The greatest heroes are defined by how completely they realized their potential, how close they came to the absolute limit of what their quirk could produce. All Might at his peak was the most complete expression of one for all that had ever existed. That was enough. That was more than enough. It held the peace of an entire nation, but it was still a ceiling. It was still a limit written into the biology of a single inherited power. And here is the problem. Goku does not have a ceiling. He has never encountered one that held Kai. The life energy that Goku draws on, cultivates, and projects is not a quirk. It is not a genetic accident. It is not a biological gift assigned at birth. It is a universal energy present in every living thing, trained and refined through decades of disciplined practice and near-death transcendence. In the Dragon Ball cosmology, the potential locked inside Ki cultivation is theoretically limitless. Every time Goku encounters a power that exceeds his own, he does not accept defeat as the evidence of a boundary. He absorbs the lesson, recovers, trains, and breaks through. That is not a quirk behavior. That is not how MHA's system of power functions at all. The scientists who would inevitably attempt to classify and study him would not simply fail to categorize his abilities. They would fail at a deeper level. Their entire conceptual framework, the language they use to understand power, would prove inadequate, and that failure would not stay in the laboratory. It would spread. The first reactions to Goku's presence would divide cleanly along lines of institutional role. UA High School, the flagship hero academy and the symbolic heart of MHA's educational system, would convene emergency meetings within hours. Staff members ranging from Aizawa to Nezu would debate simultaneously. Is he a threat, an asset, or something the existing categories cannot contain? Nezu, whose analytical intelligence operates beyond ordinary comprehension, would likely arrive at an uncomfortable answer fastest, all three, and would immediately recognize that the third category is the most dangerous. Meanwhile, the Hero Public Safety Commission would be moving through channels more political than philosophical. They would want data, yes, but more urgently, they would want classification, because in their world, a thing you cannot classify is a thing you cannot regulate, and a thing you cannot regulate is, by definition, a crisis. The scientific community would mobilize quickly. The idea of an individual generating energy outputs that defy quirk classification would be the most significant research event in decades. Multiple universities would request access simultaneously. Government-adjacent research bodies would invoke national security protocols. Some would approach the problem with genuine academic curiosity. Others would approach it with the cold, hungry pragmatism of people who immediately recognize that whatever Goku represents, whatever the source of his power actually is, it is potentially more valuable than anything the quirk genome has ever produced. Because if his power can be studied, understood, and potentially taught, then the biological lottery of quirk inheritance becomes negotiable. And a world where the power lottery becomes negotiable is a fundamentally different world. The villains would learn about him the same way everyone else would. Through media coverage that would be impossible to contain or spin. And their reactions would be the most revealing of all, because villains in My Hero Academia are not simply people who chose evil. They are people the system failed, people who built ideologies around that failure, people whose entire worldview depends on the narrative that hero society is corrupt, hypocritical, and propped up by a lie. Shigaraki's hatred runs deep and structural. The League of Villains is not merely criminal, it is ideological. It exists to prove that the system is rot all the way down. And then Goku appears, and the problem for villain ideology is not that he is a hero. He is not. He is not on the system's side. But he is also, catastrophically, not on anyone else's side either. He is simply himself. And a person who is simply and completely themselves, outside all frameworks and allegiances, is uniquely capable of making everyone else's frameworks look small. Because here is the real setup. Here is the actual collision this scenario creates beneath all the power scaling and spectacle. My Hero Academia is a world that answers the question of power with structure, with regulation, hierarchy, certification, and symbol. Its greatest heroes derive their meaning not just from their strength, but from what their strength represents within that structure. All Might was not just powerful. He was the symbol of peace, a deliberately constructed idea, a narrative the world agreed to believe in because it needed to. That narrative worked. It provided psychological stability to an entire civilization for decades. And then Goku floats down from an empty sky with a smile, and he is not a symbol of anything. He is not trying to represent hope. He is not carrying a civilization's fear on his shoulders. He is just a man who loves fighting and wants to get stronger. And in being exactly that, purely, completely, effortlessly that, he accidentally asks the question that no one in My Hero Academia's carefully managed world has ever had to answer. What happens when the symbol meets the thing the symbol was always pretending to be? The first meeting between Goku and the professional heroes of Japan was not a battle. That is the first thing you need to understand. There were no explosions, no dramatic clash of power systems colliding mid-air, no ultimatum, no standoff, no moment where two philosophies met at gunpoint and demanded the other surrender. It was something quieter and in many ways more disturbing than any of those things. It was a conversation, a perfectly pleasant, deeply unsettling conversation between a man who represented the entire institutional weight of hero society and a man who did not know, and could not be made to care, that institutional weight existed. All Might, still carrying fragments of the legend his body could no longer sustain, was the one they sent. Because if anything in that world could reach across the gap, it would be the greatest symbol it had ever produced. And even he came back, changed. All Might arrived expecting to find something he could read. Every significant threat in his career had been readable. Powerful, yes, sometimes catastrophically so, but operating within a grammar of intent, he understood. Villains wanted destruction, domination, revenge, freedom from a system that hurt them. He knew how to speak to those motivations. He knew how to stand against them. What he found instead was a man sitting cross-legged on a park bench, eating from a convenience store bag, watching pigeons with genuine interest. Goku looked up when he arrived, and his expression was that particular kind of open that only exists in people who have never learned to perform emotion for an audience. He was not impressed by All Might's presence, not dismissive either. He was simply present, fully, naturally, disarmingly present. And All Might, who had spent 30 years being the largest that, in every room he entered, felt the specific vertigo of suddenly being the smaller object in the frame. Their conversation lasted 40 minutes, and the agents monitoring it via long-range audio later described it as one of the strangest documents in Hero Commission history. Goku asked questions with the directness of a child and the precision of a warrior. Who were the strongest fighters here? What kinds of power existed in this world? Was there anyone worth having a real match with? All Might answered carefully, diplomatically, institutionally. He explained hero rankings. Goku found the concept of ranking fighters by public approval genuinely puzzling. He explained quirks. Goku listened with polite interest, the way you listen to someone describe a game you have never played. He explained the weight of being a symbol. And here, only here, did Goku go quiet. Not from incomprehension. From something more uncomfortable than that. Something that looked, in the footage review later, almost like pity. The quiet kind. The kind that does not announce itself. Izuku Midoriya found out about Goku the way he found out about most things. Obsessively, immediately, and with notebooks already open before the information had finished arriving. The footage from the market street hit him like a physical force. He watched it 17 times in the first hour, not because he could not believe what he was seeing. He believed it completely, instantly, the way people who understand power at a cellular level recognize it when it appears. But because every viewing revealed something new. The casual adjustment of posture when Goku descended. The way his feet met the ground with precisely zero impact. Not because he braked against gravity, but because he simply chose where gravity applied to him, the absence of any visible effort, any strain, any acknowledgement that what he was doing required something to be overcome. Deku filled 4 pages of notes and then stopped and stared at his own handwriting for a long time. Because the notes felt, for the first time in his life, like they were describing something his framework was not built to contain. Katsuki Bakugo's reaction was different. Simpler on the surface, volcanic underneath. He watched the footage once, with the focused intensity he brought to every piece of combat data he consumed, and his expression throughout was perfectly controlled, which for Bakugo meant his hands were shaking by the end. It was not fear. Fear was not a category Bakugo meaningfully operated in. It was something more specifically corrosive, the recognition of scale. His entire identity was built on a foundational certainty that if he worked hard enough, exploded loud enough, refused to accept limitation with sufficient fury, the top was reachable. His ceiling was always the next thing above him. That was the engine of everything. And then he watched a man stand in the sky without trying and felt the engine stall for the first time. He did not say a word about it to anyone. But that evening, he trained for 6 hours without stopping, and his explosions left scorch marks 3 times deeper than usual in the reinforced walls of the practice room. The pro-hero community's official position, announced through carefully worded commission statements, was measured reassurance. The unregistered individual had been contacted. He had not displayed hostile intent. The situation was being monitored. Protocol was being followed. Behind the official position, the actual conversation was significantly less measured. Emergency briefings at the top levels of the hero ranking system produced no consensus beyond a shared, unspoken agreement that the existing vocabulary for threat assessment was not functioning correctly. The problem was not that Goku was dangerous in the conventional sense. The problem was that the entire infrastructure of danger management in this world was built around the assumption that power had a shape, a classification, a known mechanism, an upper boundary that could be modeled and planned against. His power had no shape they could find, and planning against a shape you cannot find is not planning, it is hoping. The first real incident happened 11 days after his arrival. A mid-level villain group, emboldened perhaps by the institutional distraction Goku's presence had caused, or perhaps simply executing a plan already in motion, staged a coordinated attack in a densely populated commercial district. 3 pro-heroes responded within 90 seconds, which by any standard metric was excellent response time. By the time they arrived, 2 of the attack vectors were already contained, not by backup, not by civilians defending themselves. The third attack vector, a particularly destructive emitter-class villain whose area effect power had been the group's primary asset, was in the process of being held, perfectly still, by one hand, by a man in an orange guy who looked mildly interested in the proceedings. Goku had sensed the intent of the attack from 6 city blocks away. He had arrived before the heroes. He had resolved the most dangerous element of the situation before the most experienced professional responders had finished activating their quirks. And he had done all of it at what was, by every available measurement, a pace so far beneath his actual capability that it was less like combat and more like a man moving a piece of furniture. The footage spread within minutes. The public reaction was not simple. Enormous relief, yes. The attack had been neutralized with 0 civilian casualties and almost no property damage, a result significantly cleaner than the statistical average for incidents of that threat classification. But beneath the relief, moving through crowd reactions on social media and in the comment threads and in the conversations that took place in homes and offices and train carriages across Japan that evening, something else was running. Quieter, more uncomfortable. People were asking, not loudly, not officially, but persistently, a question that hero society had never had to seriously answer before. If one man, unregistered and unlicensed, could resolve in seconds what trained professional heroes were still deploying to contain, then what exactly were those heroes for? It was not a cruel question. It was not even an ungrateful one. It was simply the question that honest observation produces when the gap between what the system promises and what actually happens becomes too large to politely ignore. And it had only been 11 days. 11 days became 30. 30 became 90. And in those 90 days, My Hero Academia's world did not simply adjust to Goku's presence the way a river adjusts around a new stone, finding new channels, smoothing the edges, eventually incorporating the obstacle into its ordinary flow. It fractured. Slowly, structurally, in the places where the load-bearing walls of hero society had always been thinnest. The fractures did not announce themselves dramatically. They appeared in enrollment conversations at UA and the declining engagement metrics of hero agency social media accounts, in the tone of late-night political commentary programs, in the way students in hero courses began asking their teachers questions that had never previously occurred to them as askable. Questions like, is there a limit to how strong a person can become through training alone? Questions like, if quirks are genetic, are they destiny? Questions like, what if the ceiling we assumed existed? What if it was never real? These were not rebellious questions, they were honest ones. And honest questions, in a world built on managed assumptions, are the most dangerous things of all. UA High School felt the shift before it could name it. Aizawa noticed it first. He noticed most things first, in the quality of attention his students brought to training sessions. They were not less motivated. In some ways, they were more motivated, burning with a new and slightly desperate energy. But the direction of their motivation had quietly rotated. Before Goku, they trained to master their quirks, to push against the known boundary of what their individual power could produce. The goal was always the fullest expression of what they already were. Now, something had crept into the margins of their ambition. A different question. Not how do I master what I have, but what if what I have is not the only thing available to me? It was subtle. It was, in educational terms, potentially catastrophic, because the entire pedagogical architecture of UA was built around helping students reach their ceiling, not around questioning whether the ceiling existed. Deku's transformation in this period was the most visible and the most telling. He had always been exceptional in his capacity to study, analyze, and internalize the fighting styles of others. What changed was the scale of what he was now trying to internalize. He sought out Goku with a level of determined persistence that even Goku, who was generally delighted by anyone who showed genuine enthusiasm for getting stronger, eventually had to acknowledge as remarkable. Their sessions were not formal. Goku did not teach in any structured way. He demonstrated things. He explained concepts in the vocabulary of someone who had lived them rather than studied them. He talked about sensing energy in other living things, about the feeling of a power ceiling approached from the inside, about what it felt like to realize a limit was not actually a limit, but a door that opened differently than expected. Deku took notes. Deku always took notes. But for the first time, his notebooks were filling with things that had no established framework to sit inside. And he found that deeply, thrillingly terrifying. Bakugo told no one about the hours he spent watching publicly available footage of Goku's casual interventions in the weeks after his arrival. He told no one about the specific analysis he ran, competitive, tactical, the way he analyzed every significant power he encountered, where he attempted to identify the moments where Goku was operating at minimum effort and extrapolate upward from there toward a realistic maximum output. He ran the extrapolation 3 times. He got the same result each time. He deleted the calculation. He went back to training. But something had changed in the quality of his rage, and the people who knew Bakugo well enough to read his particular frequencies could feel it. Less like fury aimed at the world, more like fury aimed at a wall he had just discovered was further away than he had spent his entire life believing. Which for Bakugo was not discouraging. It was, in the most painfully honest part of him, the most exciting thing that had ever happened. Toshinori Yagi, All Might, the man who had carried peace on his shoulders until his body could carry it no more, spent the 90-day period in a state of private philosophical reckoning that he shared with almost no one. He had passed one for all to Deku. He had stepped back from the symbol. He had told himself that the transition was complete, that the age he represented was honestly finished, that this was not defeat but the natural order of legacy. He had believed it, mostly. And then Goku appeared and revealed something about the nature of what All Might had been, something that no villain had ever managed to show him with all their destruction and ideology. A symbol works because the people who need it believe it represents the highest available form of hope. All Might had been that. He had been the most powerful because within the grammar of this world's power he was. But the grammar had always been the constraint, not the measure, and now the measure had arrived, and it was standing in a park somewhere, casually eating rice balls and being cheerfully incomprehensible. The villains adapted. This was always going to happen because adaptation is what the most dangerous minds in any conflict do when the terrain changes. Shigaraki's initial reaction barely contained fury, the particular kind that comes from encountering something that does not fit any existing category of enemy or ally. gave way, slowly and dangerously, to something more strategic. He could not beat Goku in combat. He understood this with the cold clarity of someone who had calibrated his understanding of power through years of observing its real-world effects. But he did not need to beat Goku in combat. Combat was not the only theater that mattered. The theater that mattered was social, psychological. The narrative war over what Goku's existence meant. And Shigaraki understood narrative wars better than most people gave him credit for. He began building one, quietly, in the language of questions rather than proclamations. If one foreign, unregistered being can do what all your heroes combined cannot, what exactly have you been paying for? What exactly have you been trusting? The Hero Public Safety Commission's classified internal reports from this period, later partially disclosed through bureaucratic channels no one fully understood, painted a picture of institutional anxiety operating at a frequency just below public visibility. The concern was not Goku's hostility. He had displayed none. The concern was dependency, because it was already happening. Hero dispatch centers were already beginning to route certain high-level incident classifications toward geographic zones where Goku had been recently sighted, calculating response efficiency. It was not policy. No one had authorized it. It emerged organically from dispatchers making individual rational decisions about the fastest path to civilian safety. But the cumulative effect of hundreds of individual rational decisions was, functionally, the beginning of a parallel response architecture. One centered not on the licensed, regulated, institutionally accountable hero system, but on a single unclassifiable individual who might or might not be in the right place and who operated entirely on his own judgment. That was not a contingency the Commission had ever planned for. That was not a contingency the Commission had ever imagined needing to plan for. And then the scientists published their preliminary findings on Ki. The paper was technically dense, cautiously worded, laden with the qualifications and uncertainties that responsible academic work requires. But its core suggestion was impossible to misread, and it moved through the world's consciousness the way genuinely transformative ideas always do, not with a bang, but with the slow spreading pressure of something that cannot be unthought once it has been thought. Ki, the paper suggested, was not a quirk variant, not a quirk evolution, not a new branch of the existing power taxonomy. It was a fundamentally different relationship between a living organism and the energy that animated it. It was cultivated, not inherited. It was disciplined, not gifted, and its upper boundary, as best the researchers could determine from the data available, was not fixed by genetics. It was fixed by will, by training, by the refusal to accept the last limit as the final one. In a world that had organized its entire civilization around the premise that power was biological destiny, that you were born into your ceiling and the work was simply reaching it, this was not a scientific paper. It was a philosophical detonation, and the fallout was only beginning. The Ki paper changed everything and nothing at the same time. That is the particular cruelty of genuinely transformative information. It arrives, it detonates, and then the world has to keep functioning inside the wreckage of its own former certainties while pretending the walls are still standing. Hero Society did not collapse in the weeks after the paper's publication. The agencies stayed open. The rankings were updated on schedule. Heroes still responded to incidents, still filed reports, still maintained the visible architecture of a functioning system. But underneath the maintenance, something had shifted in the load-bearing structure that no amount of institutional continuity could entirely conceal. Because the paper had not simply introduced a new scientific concept, it had introduced a question that the system had no procedural answer for. If the ceiling was never biological, if transcendence was always available to anyone disciplined enough to reach for it, then what exactly had Hero Society been managing all this time? And more uncomfortably, what had it been preventing? The educational implications hit UA first and hardest, because education is always where civilizational assumptions go to either survive or die. Nezu, whose intelligence operated in a register that most human institutions were not architecturally prepared for, called an emergency faculty summit that lasted 14 hours. The question on the table was deceptively simple. If Ki cultivation was real, teachable, and potentially available to anyone regardless of quirk status, did UA have a responsibility to incorporate it into its curriculum? The surface-level answer seemed obvious. Of course, any tool that made heroes more capable was worth pursuing, but the second-order implications of that answer were where the real argument lived. Because incorporating Kai training into a quirk-based educational system was not an additive change, it was a foundational one. It implied that the entire existing framework, the classification of students by quirk type, the development of hero identities around specific inherited abilities, the ranking architecture built on the assumption that genetic power was the primary variable, was built on an incomplete picture of what humans could be. And institutions do not accept that they are incomplete without a fight. Aizawa Shouta's position in the faculty summit was characteristically blunt and characteristically correct. He had spent his career developing and deploying a fighting style built entirely on the suppression of others' quirks, and on the disciplined maximization of a body and mind that, by the metrics of hero society, were ordinary. He understood, at a level most of his colleagues did not, what it meant to build power from discipline rather than inheritance. He had always understood it. He had simply been living in a world that did not fully reward that understanding with institutional acknowledgement. When he spoke in that summit, he did not argue for or against Kai incorporation. He asked the question that no one else had found the words for yet. How long have we been teaching students that their limits are their quirks, and what has that cost the ones who had more? The room went quiet. Some things, once said in the right language by the right person, cannot be unsaid. Meanwhile, the man at the center of all this institutional turbulence was spending his afternoons sparring with increasingly desperate pro-heroes who had convinced themselves, through mechanisms of professional pride that were entirely human and entirely understandable, that finding the right matchup, the right quirk combination, the right tactical approach, would reveal some manageable ceiling in Goku's power. It was not malicious. These were genuinely skilled, genuinely dedicated professionals attempting to perform due diligence on a situation their training had given them no preparation for. The sparring sessions were always conducted carefully, with safety protocols, with civilian areas cleared, with medical support on standby, and they were always, without exception, illuminating in the same devastating way. Not because Goku was cruel or dismissive toward the heroes he fought. He was the opposite. Attentive, encouraging, visibly delighted when someone pushed him to move slightly faster or adjust his positioning. He treated every session like a gift. That was precisely the problem. A man who fights the best heroes a civilization has produced and experiences it as a pleasant recreational activity is not a man whose ceiling has been located. He is a man who has not yet been asked to look up. The media cycle, which had initially approached Goku's presence with the breathless energy of an unprecedented spectacle, began in this period to take on a different character. The early coverage had been awe-dominated. The footage compilations, the expert panel debates about quirk classification, the human interest segments about how cheerful and approachable this impossibly powerful stranger seemed to be. That phase gave way to something more anxious, more fractured, more reflective of the genuine societal ambivalence that was building beneath the surface. Opinion pieces appeared arguing that Goku's presence represented an opportunity, a chance to reimagine heroism beyond the constraints of the existing system. Counterpieces argued that an unregulated, unaccountable superbeing, however benign in apparent intent, represented exactly the kind of precedent that hero licensing laws had been designed to prevent. Talk show panels devolved into shouting matches that were less about Goku specifically and more about everything his existence had forced into visibility. The gaps in the system, the fragility of symbols, the difference between safety and the feeling of safety. The villains who were watching, and all the significant ones were watching carefully, began to recognize that the most valuable resource Goku had inadvertently delivered to them was not a power vacuum. It was a narrative vacuum. Hero Society's greatest asset had always been its story. The story that the system worked, that heroes were reliable, that the structures of licensed heroism represented humanity's best available answer to the chaos of a quirk-saturated world. That story depended on the heroes being the most impressive thing in the frame. Remove that, and the story does not simply weaken, it becomes available for rewriting. Shigaraki, with the ideological hunger that had always been his most dangerous quality beneath the destruction, began testing new lines of public-facing messaging through intermediaries and anonymous channels, not against Goku, for him in a twisted way, or at least using him. Even this stranger from nowhere can see that your heroes are theater. Even he does not submit to their bureaucracy. If power this pure refuses to be licensed, what does that tell you about the license? It was sophisticated. It was dishonest in the way only truths deployed without context can be dishonest, and it was beginning to find an audience. Ochako Uraraka said something in a late-night dormitory conversation with Tsuyu Asui that neither of them intended to become significant, but which Tsuyu later remembered as the moment she understood what Goku's presence was actually doing to the people she cared about. Ochako said, "I think the thing that scares me most is not that he's stronger than everyone. It's that he's happy. He's genuinely, completely happy doing what he does. And I realized I've never once thought about whether I'm happy. I've only ever thought about whether I'm good enough." Tsuyu, who processed things carefully and honestly, did not have an immediate answer for that, because it was not a problem that training could solve. It was not a problem that ranking could solve. It was the particular kind of problem that appears when someone from outside a system looks at the people inside it and reflects back to them, without any intention of doing so, the cost of the life they have been living. Goku had not said a word to Ochako. He had simply existed, fully and freely, in the vicinity of a world that had taught its heroes to earn the right to exist at all. All Might watched all of it, watched Deku's notebooks fill with new vocabularies, watched Bakugo's training sessions get longer and stranger and more private, watched the faculty debates at UA, watched the media cycle turn, watched the Commission's press releases become increasingly careful in ways that revealed exactly how uncertain the people writing them actually were. He watched all of it from the position of a man who had spent his entire life being the answer and who was now learning what it felt like to be the question. There was grief in it. He would not have denied that if pressed honestly. Not grief for himself, not the self-pitying kind. Grief for the version of hope he had built and offered, and that had been enough, genuinely enough for a long time. And that was now being quietly reclassified in the public imagination from greatest possible to greatest available at the time. That was a different thing, a smaller thing, not false, but smaller. And in the smallness, something else was becoming visible. Something he had not expected. Because watching Goku move through this world, watching him engage with its people with uncomplicated warmth and absolute authenticity, All Might was beginning to understand something about heroism that 30 years of being its symbol had, paradoxically, made harder to see. Heroism was not the symbol. It was never the symbol. The symbol was what you built when the real thing was too enormous to hold in your hands. And maybe, the thought arrived quietly, without fanfare, the way the truest thoughts always do. Maybe the real thing was worth holding again, even now, even broken as he was, even small as he had become. Maybe especially then. It began the way the worst things always begin in My Hero Academia, not with a declaration, not with a manifesto broadcast across emergency frequencies, not with the dramatic villain entra, that hero protocols were designed to respond to. It began with silence, a specific engineered silence. 17 simultaneous communications blackouts across Japan's major population centers, each one surgical, each one timed to the second, each one designed not to destroy infrastructure but to blind it. No explosions, no immediate casualties, just the sudden vertiginous sensation of a civilization's nervous system going dark in patches. The way a power grid fails not all at once but sequentially, each loss revealing how completely the remaining lights depended on the ones already gone. The Hero Public Safety Commission's Crisis Response Center registered the pattern 4 minutes after it began. 4 minutes was fast. 4 minutes was also, as the next several hours would demonstrate with brutal clarity, approximately 4 minutes too slow. The architecture of the attack was AFO's, not Shigaraki's fury. This was too patient for fury, too structurally sophisticated for ideology alone. This had the fingerprints of a mind that had spent decades studying systems not to destroy them dramatically, but to find the precise angles where pressure produced maximum collapse with minimum visible input. The communications blackouts were not the attack, they were the frame. Inside the frame, 15 separate villain operations activated simultaneously across the darkened zones, not the high-powered theatrical assaults that hero agencies trained their best responders to handle, but mid-level, distributed, deliberately mundane incidents. Hostage situations, infrastructure sabotage, crowd control collapses, chemical threats in enclosed spaces. None of them individually catastrophic, all of them together, spread across 17 communication-blind zones with hero response forces now unable to coordinate, creating a crisis topology that the existing dispatch architecture had no efficient answer for. It was, in the coldest and most precise sense of the word, elegant. And it was designed with one specific variable in mind. What do you do when your emergency response depends on communication, and your communication is gone? And the one entity capable of being everywhere at once is a man no one has authority over? Goku felt it before anyone told him. That was the thing about sensing ki. It did not require infrastructure. It did not require a functioning communications network or a dispatch center or a ranked hierarchy of response priorities. It required only the sensitivity to read the emotional pressure of living beings across distance, and Goku's sensitivity in this regard was developed to a degree that the MHA world had no framework to even describe accurately. What he felt, radiating from 17 points across the country simultaneously, was the particular signature of mass fear, not the sharp, localized spike of a single threat. Something broader and more complex. The low, spreading frequency of people who did not know where danger was coming from, which was in some ways more terrifying than people who did. He was moving before he consciously decided to move. This was not heroism in the institutional sense. It was not a licensed response to a categorized threat. It was simpler and older than any of that. It was the instinct of a man who had spent his entire life running toward the sound of a fight, now running toward the sound of suffering. The distinction mattered more than it appeared to. The heroes who were operating inside the blackout zones experienced the next 40 minutes in fragments, disconnected, incomplete, each one seeing only the small piece of the crisis they were physically present for. What the subsequent reconstruction of events, assembled painstakingly from hundreds of individual accounts and the partial surveillance footage that survived, she revealed was this. Goku moved across 17 separate incident sites in a time frame that, by any physics the MHA world could apply to it, should not have been possible. He did not prioritize based on tactical assessment or threat classification. He moved by feel, toward the greatest concentration of fear, toward the most immediate danger to the largest number of people, following a moral calculus that was not sophisticated or institutional but was, in its directness, more efficient than any algorithm the Commission's crisis response software had ever produced. He resolved incidents, contained villains, redirected chemical dispersal, moved civilians, did all of it at a pace so far beneath his actual capability that the people he helped had the surreal experience of being saved by someone who seemed only mildly engaged in the process, the way a skilled craftsman appears relaxed while performing the task they have spent a lifetime mastering. But the 16th site was different. Someone had planned for the possibility of Goku. Of course they had. AFO had planned for the possibility of Goku with the same cold thoroughness he brought to every variable he identified as significant. The 16th site was not designed to be resolved quickly. It was designed to hold him. A mass civilian containment scenario. Hundreds of people, an enclosed underground structure, a villain with a quirk that destabilized spatial geometry within a defined radius, making teleportation and high-speed movement inside the affected zone potentially fatal to anything caught in the distortion field. It was a trap with a conscience built in, not a trap that killed, a trap that forced the question, do you move fast and risk the people you are trying to save, or do you move carefully and spend time you do not have while the other 16 sites burn? For the first time since his arrival in this world, Goku was presented with a problem that his power alone could not instantly dissolve. And the heroes watching the sensor readings from outside the blackout zone, the ones who had access to the partial data that was still filtering through degraded channels, felt something they had not expected to feel in relation to this man. They felt afraid for him. And in feeling afraid for him, they felt something shift in the geography of how they understood him. He was not a resource. He was not a contingency. He was, in the truest sense, a person facing a problem in a world that was not his own, trying to protect people who had no particular claim on his loyalty, for no reason except that he was Goku, and this was what Goku did. And that realization hit harder than any of his combat displays had. What happened inside the 16th site was not captured in full. The spatial distortion affected recording equipment as severely as it affected movement. What the accounts agree on is that Goku spent 11 minutes inside a geometry that was designed to trap him, moving with a precision and deliberateness entirely unlike his usual fluid speed, making decisions that prioritized civilian safety over his own positioning in ways that revealed something about his fighting philosophy that pure power display had always obscured. He was not simply strong. He was careful in the way that only people who genuinely value what they are protecting can be careful, not performing care for an audience, but actually, functionally, strategically careful, because the alternative was unacceptable to him on a level that preceded logic. All civilians were moved, the villain was contained, the distortion field collapsed. Goku walked out of the structure with a small cut on his forearm, the first visible injury anyone in this world had seen him sustain, and looked at it with an expression of mild interest, the way you look at something slightly surprising and not particularly important. The heroes outside stared at that cut for longer than made rational sense, because it was evidence of something they had needed without knowing they needed it. He was not immune to this world. He was not untouchable by it. He had simply chosen to take its damage rather than risk someone else taking it. That choice, small, personal, undramatic, was more heroic than anything the ranking system had ever figured out how to measure. The 17th site was the one AFO had built as the real message, not a villain operation at all, in any conventional sense, a media operation, a coordinated release of intercepted commission communications, real documents, genuine internal records, that had been obtained through the intelligence infrastructure that AFO had spent years quietly building inside the institutions he professed to hate. The documents revealed what the Commission had actually been discussing in its classified sessions since Goku's arrival. The dependency risk projections, the failed containment protocols, the dispatch routing changes that had organically begun funneling high-level incidents toward Goku's probable location, the internal debates about whether to attempt legal mechanisms to bring him under Commission authority. Presented without context, deployed into the information vacuum created by the communications blackout, framed through the channels that had been quietly amplifying villain-adjacent narratives for weeks, the documents told a story that was not false, but was not complete. They told the story of a hero system that had, within 3 months of encountering something it could not classify, already begun restructuring itself around that thing, while publicly claiming everything was under control. It was the truth of a system under pressure. And the truth of a system under pressure is always the most damaging thing its enemies can find. By the time communications were restored and the crisis was officially classified as contained, the damage to the institutional narrative was already done in a way that press conferences and careful commission statements could not reverse. The hero system had survived the attack. Goku had covered the gaps that the attack was designed to expose. But surviving an attack designed to reveal your vulnerabilities is not the same as proving you did not have them. The footage that circulated in the aftermath, Goku moving through 17 sites while licensed heroes operated in isolated pockets, unable to coordinate, told its own story. Not the story of heroes failing. The story of a system whose ceiling had been exceeded by an event it was not built to handle, and whose response had relied functionally on a single unregulated individual whose presence it had never officially sanctioned and could not officially explain. The world had been saved, and in being saved this way, it had been permanently changed. Because there is a before and an after to the moment a civilization discovers that its safety was being guaranteed by something it did not choose, did not understand, and could not control. And My Hero Academia was now living in the after. The Commission's emergency session lasted 3 days, not 3 days of scheduled meetings with breaks for meals and sleep. 3 days of continuous, rotating, fractured crisis management in which the people responsible for the structural integrity of hero society sat in rooms together and tried to find language for a problem that kept escaping the vocabulary they brought to it. The session was classified at the highest available level. Its existence was not publicly confirmed for 11 days after it concluded. What leaked, through the same intelligence channels that had been compromised to produce the 17th Site's Document D, imp through the particular human inability to maintain secrecy in conditions of genuine panic, painted a picture of an institution experiencing something that institutions rarely allow themselves to experience honestly. Not strategic recalibration, not policy review, genuine foundational uncertainty about whether the model it had been operating on was still adequate to the world it was supposed to be managing. That uncertainty, once it appeared in the room, proved impossible to close the door on again. The official public response was competent and almost entirely unconvincing. Commissioner statements emphasized the success of the crisis resolution. 17 sites, 0 fatalities, containment achieved within the operational window. They acknowledged the communications vulnerabilities revealed by the attack and announced infrastructure investment to address them. They said nothing about Goku's role in the resolution that was not carefully hedged with institutional language designed to position his contribution as supplementary rather than central. Supplementary. The word appeared in the official statement 4 times. People counted. Because people had watched the footage by then, the fragmentary, partial, stitched-together footage that showed a man in an orange G moving through 17 crisis sites while the licensed, ranked, institutionally sanctioned heroes of Japan operated in isolated pockets without coordination. Supplementary was the word chosen to describe that, and the distance between the word and the footage was so vast that it produced, in the public consciousness, exactly the opposite of the reassurance it was intended to convey. It produced the specific, corrosive kind of distrust that forms not when you catch an institution lying, but when you catch it believing its own language more than it believes its own evidence. The hero ranking cycle was due to be published 2 weeks after the crisis. The commission delayed it, then delayed it again. The delay itself became a story because the ranking cycle was not simply a list. It was the ritual through which hero society renewed its own narrative of functional meritocracy. The ranked list said, "Here are the most capable protectors, ordered by their demonstrated value, and this order reflects the health and reliability of the system that produced them." Publishing that list in the immediate aftermath of a crisis that had been functionally resolved by someone who could not appear on it, who had no rank, no license, no agency affiliation, no approval rating, publishing it felt, to everyone inside the commission who had to make the decision, like performing a ceremony whose meaning had quietly left the building, and yet not publishing it felt worse, because not publishing it was an admission, and admissions of that particular kind once made have a tendency to expand. Enji Todoroki, Endeavor, the #1 hero by every metric the ranking system could apply, sat in his agency office during this period and did something that people who knew him would have found almost incomprehensible to witness. He sat quietly, not planning, not training, not driving himself and everyone around him toward the next performance target with the controlled ferocity that had defined his entire professional existence. He sat with a document in front of him, the crisis response analysis his agency had compiled, breaking down the timeline of the 17-site incident site by site, hero by hero, action by action. And he read it with the careful attention of a man who has decided, perhaps for the first time in his professional life, to look at data not for what it confirms, but for what it says. What it said was this: at the moment of maximum simultaneous DEMA, and the system that had ranked him first had been insufficient, not because the heroes failed. They had not failed. They had performed at or above their training benchmarks in conditions that exceeded those benchmarks. The system had been insufficient because the benchmarks themselves were insufficient. And the #1 hero, the man who had spent decades defining himself entirely by his position within the ranking structure, was sitting quietly with the evidence that the structure had always been measuring against an incomplete picture of what the job could require. That was not a tactical problem. That was an identity problem. And identity problems cannot be solved by training harder within the existing framework. Shigaraki disappeared from all known surveillance in the week following the crisis. This was noted and alarming, but the intelligence implications were secondary to what his absence meant ideologically, because Shigaraki's power, his real power beyond the destructive capability of his quirk, had always been his clarity of purpose. He knew what he hated. He knew what he wanted to destroy. The hero system, the institutions, the symbols that held the civilian population's trust together. His hatred was specific, personal, and completely coherent within its own logic. What Goku's existence had introduced into that coherence was a complication that pure ideology could not easily process. Because Goku was not a hero in the system's sense. He was not a symbol. He was not licensed or ranked or beholden to the commission. He had functionally done more damage to the system's credibility narrative in 3 months of cheerful, well-intentioned existence than the League of Villains had managed with years of deliberate assault. And he had done it without trying, without ideology, without even understanding that there was a war being fought over the meaning of Po. We're in this civilization. That was the complication. Because you cannot hate something that is not trying to be what you hate, and you cannot use something as a weapon when it does not know it is being held. Deku found Goku at the edge of the city on the 4th morning after the crisis, sitting on a concrete barrier watching the sunrise with the particular quality of attention that Goku brought to everything. Complete, present, not performing contemplation, but actually engaged in it. Deku had come with specific questions, written down, the way he prepared for every important conversation. He looked at his notebook and then put it away, because the questions he had written assumed a framework that felt, in the physical presence of the man sitting on that barrier watching the light change, slightly beside the point. So instead he sat down next to him and said the thing that was actually true. I don't know how to want to be a hero the same way I did before you got here. Goku looked at him, not with pity, not with wisdom deployed for effect, with the simple, direct attention of someone genuinely interested in what another person is saying. He asked, "What way did you want to be a hero before?" And Deku, who had been preparing to receive an answer, found himself instead having to find one, which was, though he did not know it yet, exactly the right thing to happen to him. The conversation lasted 2 hours. What passed between them in those 2 hours was not recorded, not leaked, not eventually disclosed through any of the channels that had been consuming and redistributing information about Goku since his arrival. It remained entirely between them. What Deku wrote in his notebook afterward, the entry that Tsuyu later described seeing over his shoulder when he left it open for a moment, not reading it but registering its texture, was not analysis. It was not tactical observation. It was something that looked more like the kind of writing a person does when they are trying to hold on to an experience that keeps slipping into feeling rather than thought. The only line Tsuyu reported seeing clearly enough to remember was near the bottom of the page. It said, "He doesn't fight to prove something. He fights because it's the most alive he knows how to be." And I think I've been confusing those two things my whole life. She did not mention seeing it to anyone for a long time, because it felt like something that belonged to Deku, not to the world's current appetite for information about what Goku's presence was doing to the people around him. And also because she recognized it the way you recognize something that was always true about yourself that you had not found words for yet. The reckoning that My Hero Academia was undergoing in these weeks was not visible in any single dramatic event. It was visible in the accumulation of small, private human moments of recalibration. Endeavor sitting quietly with an analysis report, Bakugo running calculations he deleted, Ochako asking whether she had ever thought about happiness, Deku writing sentences that looked more like confessions than notes. The reckoning was happening at the level of individual people inside the system deciding, each in their own private language, that something about how they understood their purpose did not fully survive contact with Goku's existence. This is not the kind of reckoning that gets resolved cleanly. It does not produce a new policy or a revised ranking system or an updated commission statement. It produces people who are quietly, irrevocably different from who they were before, and people who are quietly, irrevocably different carry that difference forward into everything they subsequently build. The system might look the same from the outside. The people holding it up were already changed, and eventually, not today, not this month, but eventually, changed people build different things. That was Goku's most lasting impact on this world, and he would never know he had made it. He was already thinking about the next fight. The question arrived eventually, the way all genuinely important questions do. Not announced, not scheduled, not delivered through official channels with formal language and institutional weight behind it. It arrived in the space between other things. In a conversation that had been ostensibly about logistics, about the practical realities of Goku's continued presence in Japan, about the Commission's need for some kind of formal framework to describe what his relationship to the hero system actually was. It arrived when the Commission's senior representative, halfway through a carefully prepared statement about cooperative agreements and provisional status classifications, looked at the man sitting across the table from her and realized that every word she was saying was landing in a place that had no architecture to receive it. And so she stopped, put down her prepared statement, and asked, with a directness that surprised everyone in the room, including herself, "Do you want to stay? Not legally, not institutionally, not within the framework of what the Commission could offer or regulate or sanction. Just, do you want to stay?" And Goku looked at her with those clear, uncomplicated eyes and said he had not decided yet. Which was, in its honesty, the most destabilizing answer he could possibly have given. The fact that the decision was his to make was itself the statement. Hero Society had spent weeks attempting, through various institutional mechanisms, to find a lever, legal, diplomatic, bureaucratic, social, that would give the Commission meaningful influence over Goku's continued presence and behavior, not control. They had abandoned the fantasy of control relatively early. Influence, some functional mechanism by which the most powerful entity currently operating within Japanese borders could be encouraged, incentivized, or at minimum predicted. Every mechanism failed. Not because Goku resisted them. He was not resistant in any adversarial sense. He was simply indifferent to them in the way that a river is indifferent to the property lines drawn on a map of the land it flows through. The lines are real. The river does not know they are there, and you cannot negotiate with a river about respecting boundaries that exist in a language the river has never encountered. The Commission's senior staff, who had spent careers mastering the language of institutional leverage, were discovering what it felt like to be fluent in a language that had no speakers on the other side of the table. The heroes closest to him made their own versions of the same approach, each filtered through their individual character in ways that revealed as much about them as about him. Endeavor came directly, because Endeavor always came directly. It was perhaps his only genuinely admirable quality in a personality that had accumulated many less admirable ones. He did not ask Goku to stay or go. He asked what Goku thought Hero Society was missing. The question cost him something visible to say, which made Goku take it seriously. Goku thought about it for a long time. Long enough that Endeavor, who was accustomed to filling silences with action, had to sit in the quiet and wait. Then Goku said, "You all fight like you're trying to prove something to each other. The strongest ones especially. You should fight like there's nobody watching." Endeavor said nothing, but something moved behind his eyes. Something that had been pressing against the interior of his carefully maintained facade for a long time, trying to find a crack wide enough to fit through. That something found the crack. And what came through it was not comfortable, but it was real. All Might's approach was the one that mattered most narratively, and he knew it, which made it the hardest one to make. He found Goku in the same park where their first conversation had taken place. The bench, the pigeons, the convenience store bag, an almost comical consistency in how Goku occupied spaces. The legendary former hero and the impossible visitor from another cosmology sat together in the afternoon light. And All Might said the thing he had been building toward since the moment he first looked at Goku and felt that particular vertigo. He said, "I spent my entire career being the ceiling. I told myself that was enough, that being the highest point people could see gave them permission to feel safe. And then you arrived, and I understood that a ceiling is just a floor with better marketing." Goku laughed, not cruelly. He was not capable of cruelty in that register. Genuinely, warmly, the laugh of someone who appreciated honesty. And then he said something that All Might carried with him for the rest of his life, quietly, in the place where the most important things live. "The best fighters I ever met were never trying to be the top. They were trying to be more tomorrow than they were today. The ceiling is just what you see when you stop looking up. The villain community's relationship with the question of Goku's continued presence was the most structurally interesting of any groups, because it was the most divided. The faction around Shigaraki, ideological, destruction-oriented, motivated by hatred of the system, found Goku's presence useful precisely because it destabilized the system without requiring them to do anything. Every day Goku existed in Japan and was not integrated into the Commission's authority structure was another day the fiction of institutional control over all significant power was visibly false. His departure would paradoxically be a loss for them. It would allow the narrative of systemic competence to begin reassembling itself. His continued presence kept the wound open. The faction around AFO's longer strategic vision understood something more nuanced and more dangerous. Goku staying permanently would eventually produce a new equilibrium, one in which society adapted to his presence and stabilized around it. The truly destabilizing scenario was not Goku staying or Goku leaving. It was Goku deciding, exercising sovereign judgment about his own presence in this world, making a choice that the entire institutional apparatus of hero society had no meaningful input into. The act of deciding, more than the decision itself, was the demonstration. Deku came to Goku on the eve of what everyone in the hero community had begun calling, without official designation, the decision. The moment when Goku's continued ambiguity about his future in this world would have to resolve into something. Deku came not with questions this time, and not with his notebook. He came with something harder to carry: honesty about what he wanted. He wanted Goku to stay. He wanted it with the specific, personal hunger of someone who had encountered a model of growth and strength and simple, joyful engagement with power that he had never seen before and could not imagine finding again if it left. He said all of this plainly, in the direct way that Deku, beneath all his anxiety and overthinking, was capable of when the thing he was saying mattered enough. And then he said the other thing, the harder thing, the thing that cost him more to say because it revealed more. But I know that wanting you to stay because of what it does for me isn't a good enough reason. And I think part of growing into what One for All is supposed to be means learning to want things for the right reasons, not just the comfortable ones. Goku looked at him for a long time after that, and the look was not pity, and it was not pride exactly, but it was something in the territory between them. Something that recognized a person in the process of becoming something more than they currently were. Coming from Goku, that recognition was not a small thing. The decision, when it came, did not come through any institutional channel. There was no press conference, no commission announcement, no carefully managed media release. Goku simply told the people he had come to know, All Might, Deku, Aizawa, the commission representative who had asked him directly, told them separately, in his own time, in the language he actually used rather than the language situations were supposed to require. He was going to leave. Not because this world had failed him or disappointed him or because the fighting was insufficient, though by his standards it had been mostly a gentle warm-up. He was going to leave because staying, he had realized, would solve a problem this world needed to solve itself. He said it more simply than that. He said, if I'm here, nobody has to figure out how strong they can really get. And figuring that out is the whole point. He said it without tragedy and without apology, the way he said everything, cleanly, directly, from the uncomplicated center of who he was. And the people who heard it carried it differently. But every one of them carried it. The last evening before he left, Goku did something that no one had thought to ask for, and that no one who witnessed it would ever fully be able to describe to someone who hadn't. He powered up. Not to fight, not to demonstrate. He simply let the energy he carried, the vast, accumulated, endlessly trained and transcended power that represented decades of growth beyond every limit he had encountered, he let it be visible. Standing in an empty field outside the city at sunset, he let it show, the sky-chan, jet color around him. The air pressure shifted for kilometers in every direction. The ground cracked in a perfect radius, and above Musutafu, every person who looked up saw something in the upper atmosphere that the meteorologists could not explain, and that the commission later classified as an atmospheric anomaly, and that the people who saw it knew, immediately and without needing to be told, was not an atmospheric anomaly. It lasted 47 seconds. Then he powered down, smiled at the empty field, and went to find something to eat before bed. 47 seconds. The exact duration that Hero Society needed to understand, permanently and without any remaining ambiguity, the distance between where it stood and where the horizon actually was. He was gone before sunrise. No farewell event, no commission send-off, no press coverage because no one in any official capacity had been informed of a departure time to cover. The field outside Musutafu, where 47 seconds of visible power had rewritten. The upper atmosphere was empty and cold in the early morning, the cracked ground already accumulating frost in the geometric patterns the pressure wave had left behind. A few birds moved through the silence. The city behind the field was waking up in its ordinary rhythms. Trains beginning their routes, convenience stores receiving deliveries, the first heroes of the morning shift checking into their agencies with the particular alertness that early shifts require. The world doing what worlds do. Continuing. And somewhere in the continuation, in the space between one breath and the next, Goku was simply no longer in it. The sky above Musutafu was blue and clean and entirely ordinary, and the ordinary had never felt so loud. The first week after his departure had a quality that people who lived through it later struggled to articulate accurately. Not grief exactly. Grief requires loss of something you possessed, and no one had possessed Goku. Not relief, though some people felt that too, and felt guilty about feeling it. Something closer to the specific atmospheric condition that follows a storm, when the air is different, permanently different, carrying the chemical memory of the pressure that moved through it, and everything looks the same, but the light falls on it strangely. People went to work, students went to class, heroes went on patrol. The commission resumed its operational schedule. The ranking cycle, delayed twice, was finally published with the carefully managed fanfare that the ritual required. And all of it happened, and all of it was real, inside an atmosphere that had been permanently altered by 47 seconds of visible power and 3 months of cheerful, devastating, transformative presence. The ranking cycle's publication produced the smallest public response it had generated in a decade. Not negative response, not criticism or controversy. Simply quietness. A muted engagement that the Commission's communications team tracked with increasing concern through the analytics that governed their understanding of public sentiment. People looked at the list, acknowledged the names, moved on. The list itself had not changed dramatically. The heroes on it were the same capable, dedicated professionals they had always been. But something about the act of ranking them, the implied claim that this ordering represented the meaningful upper boundary of available protection, sat differently in the public imagination now. Not falsely. The heroes were genuinely the best the system had produced. The system had simply been revealed, irrevocably and without malice, to be measuring against an incomplete picture of what best could mean. And measurements against incomplete pictures are not wrong. They are just small in ways they cannot acknowledge. Deku trained differently from the morning after Goku left. Not harder. He had always trained at the limit of what his body and inherited power could sustain. Differently. The change was in the quality of his attention during training, in the questions he brought to his own development, in the space he left inside each session for something that had not been there before. The genuine, open-ended uncertainty of a person who no longer believed they could see their own ceiling. That uncertainty was not comfortable. Deku was someone who had always managed difficulty by converting it into specific, addressable problems. Analyze the obstacle, develop the response, execute, improve. Open-ended uncertainty does not convert easily into specific addressable problems. It requires a different relationship with not knowing. A willingness to train toward a destination you cannot see because you have stopped assuming the destination is visible from where you currently stand. It was harder than anything One for All had asked of him. It was also, he was beginning to understand, closer to what One for All had always actually been asking. Bakugo never spoke about Goku publicly, not in the weeks after his arrival, not during the crisis, not in the departure's aftermath. He trained, competed, performed at the level that his enormous capability and furious discipline produced, which remained extraordinary by every available standard, and said nothing. But the people who trained alongside him noticed something in the months that followed that they did not have consensus language for. His ceiling-seeking had changed character, where before his training had the quality of a man attacking a wall, furious, percussive, driven by the need to break through whatever was directly in front of him. It now had something more expansive in it. Less like attacking a wall, more like running toward a horizon he had stopped pretending was closer than it was. He was still Bakugo, still volcanic, still ruthlessly competitive, still allergic to anything resembling comfortable satisfaction. But the competition had quietly expanded its scope. He was no longer just competing against the heroes around him. He was competing against a version of himself he could not yet fully imagine. And for Bakugo, that was not discouraging. That was the only competition worth running. All Might began speaking differently in his lectures at UA. Not dramatically. He did not arrive one morning and announce a philosophical revision, did not frame his changed perspective as a reaction to anything, because the changed perspective was too personal and too structural to be reduced to a reaction. The change was in the texture of what he said about heroism. He had always taught heroism as the fullest expression of what you were given. Maximize your gift, embody it completely, let it be the thing that defines your contribution. Now he began leaving space in those lectures for a different idea, the idea that what you are given is not the only measure of what you can become, that the ceiling is a starting point for a different kind of question, not a destination. He never mentioned Goku by name in these lectures. He did not need to. The students who had been there, who had watched and felt and been changed by 3 months of impossible presence, recognized the source, and the students who had not been there yet, the new ones arriving into a system that was quietly, structurally different from what it had been, received the idea cleanly, without the context, as something that had simply always been part of what UA taught, which was, in its way, the most powerful kind of change, the kind that becomes invisible because it becomes normal. The villain landscape shifted in ways that took longer to fully manifest, but that were, in retrospect, more significant than any of the immediate institutional responses. Shigaraki's absence from surveillance resolved into a period of ideological reorganization within what remained of the League's structure, quieter, more internal, less focused on spectacular assault, and more focused on the longer strategic question of what the movement's purpose actually was in a world that had just been shown, by a completely disinterested third party, that Hero Society's symbolic authority was more fragile than its operational capability. The discovery that the two things were separable, that you could undermine the symbol without defeating the function, was not new information for villain ideology, but having it demonstrated so completely, so publicly, and so accidentally by someone with no stake in the demonstration gave it a different weight. AFO, operating from whatever depth he had retreated to, understood this with characteristic precision. The most useful thing Goku had done for the long war against Hero Society was not destabilize its response capability. It was destabilize its story. And stories, once destabilized, require enormous institutional energy to restabilize. Energy that would not be available for other things. The field outside Musutafu became something over the months that followed, not officially, not through any designation or decision or planning process, simply through the accumulated behavior of people who found themselves drawn to it for reasons they could not always articulate cleanly. Heroes went there. Students went there. Civilians went there. Ordinary people who had watched footage of 47 seconds of visible power and felt something in that watching that they had not found language for yet. The cracked ground where the pressure wave had geometrically fractured the earth became a kind of informal landmark, not marked on any map, not named in any official document. People stood at its edge and looked at the patterns in the ground and thought about ceilings and horizons and the difference between the two. Some of them trained there afterward, not because the location had power, but because standing at the physical evidence of a power beyond the system's framework had a clarifying effect on what they were training toward. The frost returned each morning. The birds moved through. The city continued its rhythms behind them, and the cracked ground remained cracked, patient and permanent, a record written in geology of the 47 seconds that changed everything, and that everyone was still, in their different private languages, trying to understand. Here is the truth that My Hero Academia could not say out loud, even after everything. Even after the crisis and the commission sessions and the ranking cycle's muted reception and the field outside Musutafu becoming an unofficial monument to a 47-second education in scale. The truth it could not say was this: the system had not been wrong. That is the part that gets lost when people tell this story as a simple cautionary tale about institutional arrogance or symbolic fragility. Hero Society had not been wrong to build what it built. In a world of 80% quirk prevalence, in a civilization that had genuinely needed to domesticate the chaos of genetic power distribution, the answer it had constructed, licensed heroism, ranked capability, managed symbols, regulated strength, had been a real answer to a real problem. T had worked. It had saved lives. It had held things together that would otherwise have come apart in genuinely catastrophic ways. The system was not wrong. It was simply, permanently, incomplete. And those are not the same thing. But living with the difference between them is harder than living with either one alone. What Goku had done to My Hero Academia was not conquest. It was not correction. It was not even disruption in the intentional sense. He had not arrived with a diagnosis of what was broken and a prescription for what needed to change. He had arrived with no agenda beyond the pure, ancient, simple one that had always driven him. Find something worth fighting, get stronger, enjoy the process, protect what matters when protection is needed. That was all. That was the entirety of what he brought. And yet that entirety, applied against the surface of a world built on managed heroism and institutional symbolism, had produced something that the most sophisticated villain ideology and the most powerful quirk-based assault had never managed to produce. It had produced honest self-examination, not the performed kind, the commission's press releases, the carefully managed statements, the strategic acknowledgments designed to control narrative, the actual kind. The private, irreversible, quietly devastating kind that happens when a person or an institution is confronted with evidence it cannot spin and has to decide, alone, in the dark, what it is actually made of. The students of UA, not just Deku and Bakugo and Todoroki, but the full population of a generation being trained into heroism inside a system that had just been permanently altered, carried the experience forward in ways that would not be fully visible for years. They trained in a curriculum that was beginning, slowly and incompletely, and with all the friction that genuine institutional change produced. To incorporate ideas about disciplined transcendence alongside inherited capability. They graduated into hero agencies that were quietly, structurally different from the ones their predecessors had entered, more uncertain about their own sufficiency, more honest about the gap between what the ranking system measured and what the job could actually require, more willing to ask the questions that the system had previously discouraged because answering them was expensive. They were not better heroes yet. They were the beginning of a generation of heroes who knew they were not finished yet, which is a different thing, a harder thing, and ultimately, if the history of this world was to go anywhere worth going, the necessary thing. The villains who had hoped that Goku's presence would accelerate the collapse of Hero Society's legitimacy found, in the years that followed, that they had misread the mechanism of change. The legitimacy had not collapsed. It had contracted, pulled back from the grandiose claims of the symbol era, retreated from the fiction that the system represented the ceiling of human potential, abandoned the performance of invincibility that had always required more maintenance than the actual work of heroism. What remained after the contraction was smaller and less spectacular, and in a way that the villain ideological framework had not prepared for, harder to attack, because the story that is easiest to destroy is the story that overclaims. A system that admits its limits is a system that has removed the most accessible lever for delegitimization. Hero Society had not solved its problems. It had become, slowly and painfully, more honest about them. And honesty, however imperfect, is structurally more durable than performance. Toshinori Yagi lived long enough to see the first generation of heroes who trained for transcendence rather than ceiling, who approached the question of their own development not as the maximization of an inherited gift, but as the beginning of an open-ended inquiry into what disciplined human will could actually produce. He saw them and recognized in them something he had spent his career embodying without knowing he was embodying it, because One for All had always been, at its structural core, a power that grew through inheritance and sacrifice and the refusal to accept the last bearer's limit as the permanent one. He had always been, without the language for it, a key cultivator in a quirk world. He had simply never had the framework to see it. Goku had given him the framework, not intentionally, not pedagogically, simply by existing as the fullest available expression of what that framework produced. And All Might, in his diminished, aging, deeply human body, found that he was grateful, not bitterly, not wistfully, genuinely, cleanly, with the particular peace of a man who has finally found the language for something he always knew was true. The field outside Musutafu was officially designated a public space in the 3rd year after Goku's departure, not a monument, not a memorial, because the Commission could not officially commemorate an unregistered individual's impact on national hero infrastructure without creating documentation problems that no one wanted to navigate. It was designated simply as a park. Open green space with maintained paths and benches, and at its center, preserved behind a simple transparent barrier that kept weather and visitors from eroding it further, the cracked geometric pattern in the earth that 47 seconds of visible power had left behind. The placard beside it said nothing about Goku. It said nothing about power or ceilings or the distance between where hero society stood and where the horizon actually was. It said only, this ground was changed by something that passed through here, which was technically accurate, which was, for people who knew what it meant, everything, and which was, for people who did not know what it meant, the beginning of a question worth asking. Izuku Midoriya became the greatest hero his world had ever produced. This happened. It was not a fantasy or a projection or an aspiration. It happened through decades of the particular combination of inherited power and disciplined growth and open-ended inquiry that Goku's presence had helped him understand was possible. He never reached Goku's level. No one in My Hero Academia's world did in his lifetime. But that was not, he understood eventually, the point. The point was not to reach Goku's level. The point was to stop deciding in advance that your level was already visible from where you currently stood. The point was to train toward the horizon rather than the ceiling, to grow the way Goku grew, not because a genetic accident had given you a specific gift to maximize, but because you had decided every day to be more than you were yesterday, and you had refused to let any version of yourself that had ever existed become the final version. He carried that understanding like a second inheritance, quieter than One for All, less dramatic, not transferable, but his. Completely his, and in the end, more defining. And maybe that is the final thing to understand about what it would mean for Goku to arrive in the world of My Hero Academia. Not the power scaling, not the villain defeats, or the crisis resolution, or the 47 seconds that changed the color of the sky. The final thing is this: he would not come to save them. He would not come to judge them. He would not even come to teach them, because teaching requires intention. And Goku's gifts had never been intentional. They had always been the byproduct of someone who was simply, completely, unstoppably himself in the presence of people who had not yet found out what that looked like. He would come, stay for 2-3 months, eat convenience store food, have conversations that mattered more than battles, power up once at sunset in an empty field, and leave before anyone could make him something he was not. And in doing all of that, in being nothing more and nothing less than entirely himself, he would leave behind the cruelest and most generous gift imaginable. A world forever aware of the distance between where it stood and where it could go. Forever unable to mistake its current strongest for its final form. Forever reaching, now, toward a horizon it had once believed was a ceiling. That is not salvation. That is something harder and more lasting than salvation. That is the moment a civilization stops lying to itself about its own limits. And in a universe as dark, as political, as symbol-dependent as My Hero Academia, that moment, quiet, accidental, irreversible, might be the most powerful thing that ever happened to it.